धेरै धन्यवाद। मैले चाहिँ स्टिफन माइक्सवेललाई सानै बाल्यकालदेखि चिनेको। उहाँ त्यो बेला रिसर्च गर्दै हुनुहुँदो रहेछ। म त भर्खर 4-5 वर्षको थिएँ होला। 4 वर्षको थिएँ। 6 सो मलाई चाहिँ एकदम फ्यासिनेटिङ लाग्थ्यो हैन। हामी हाम्रो समाजबारे अध्ययन गर्न आउनुभएको, अनि राजनीतिक गफगाफ पनि अब मेरो बाआमासँग अलि मिल्ने जस्तो लाग्थ्यो त्यो बेला हैन। अनि पछि अलिक बढी घनिष्ठता चाहिँ जब म पनि पढ्न थालेँ सोशल साइन्सेस, मेरो एमफिलको विषयमा पनि जब मैले पढिरहेको थिएँ त्यसमा फेरि मैले हैन उहाँको कृति किताब पढेँ, केही च्याप्टरहरू पढेँ र कहिलेकाहीँ उहाँले मलाई धेरै इन्ट्रेस्टिङ पेपरहरू पठाउनुहुन्थ्यो इमेलमा। ह्याना एरेन्ट हैन, मार्क्सलाई नै पढ्ने नयाँ तरिकाहरू, लेनिनको बारेमा, लेनिनको क्रिटिकहरू। र पछिल्लो समय चाहिँ उहाँ भूमि सम्बन्धी आफै पनि युएसमा रहेर वैकल्पिक अभ्यासहरूमा संलग्न रहनु भएको र त्योसँग जोडिएर धेरै गहिरो दार्शनिक कुराहरू चाहिँ उहाँ कहिलेकाहीँ गर्नुहुन्छ कि। अनि मलाई के लाग्यो भने म आफै पनि अझ बुझ्न चाहन्छु र यो अरूसँग पनि सेयर गर्न पाए चाहिँ गजब हुन्थ्यो भन्ने लागेर नै यो वार्तालाप एकचोटि गरौँ न भनेको। उहाँ एकदम कम बोल्ने, अलि एकदम आउटस्पोकन खालको पनि हुनुहुन्न, त्यही भएर मैले नै इन्सिस्ट गरेर आज चाहिँ उहाँसँग भएको कुराहरू चाहिँ अलिकति सेयर गरौँ भनेर हो। र उहाँले भनिहाल्नुभयो, देवेन्द्रजीले, उहाँ एन्थ्रोपोलोजिस्टको रूपमा ट्रेन्ड हो, तर उहाँ आफूले चाहिँ के भन्नुहुन्छ भने आधा जीवन जति त उहाँले जे सिक्नुभयो त्यसलाई अनलर्न गर्नेमै बिताइराख्नु भएको छ। सो त्यहीबाट चाहिँ हामी एन्ट्री पोइन्ट गर्न चाहन्छौँ। विशेष गरी पद्धति, एकाडेमिकली पनि जुन मेथोडोलोजी हो उहाँले अप्नाइरहनु भएको। आफ्नो डिजर्टेसन उहाँले बन्दीपुर बजारका मर्चेन्टहरूमा आधारित भएर डिजर्टेसन पिएचडी रिसर्च गर्नुभएको थियो। कतिपय समाजशास्त्रका विद्यार्थीहरूले पढेका पनि रहेछौँ होइन। त्यसमा पनि केही उहाँको यो कल्चरल थियोरीलाई क्रिटिक गर्दै उहाँले अलि मार्क्सिस्ट होइन, हिस्टोरिकल मटेरियलिस्ट मेथोडोलोजी अपनाउँदै अनि पछिल्लो पछिल्लो अवस्थामा उहाँले के भन्न खोजिराख्नु भएको छ भने म अझ इभल्भ भएको छु, म अझ थुप्रै चिजहरू अनलर्न गर्दैछु र एउटा नयाँ संश्लेषण, न्यू सिन्थेसिस होइन। आजको छलफलको मेन कुरा पनि न्यू सिन्थेसिस भएको हुनाले हामी त्यही विषयमा उहाँको कुरा जान्न चाहन्छौँ कि वाट इज दिस यो नयाँ खालको मेथोडोलोजी के हुनसक्छ। विशेष गरी उहाँले चाहिँ यो संसारलाई बुझ्ने बेसिक जुन प्रिमाइस हो त्यसमै खोट भइरहेको छ, त्यसमै केही पुनर्विचार गर्नुपर्ने। And we have to rethink the basic premises of our relationship with the world. भन्ने उहाँको चाहिँ मैले पाउँछु। So I want to start with your methodological approach, both academically and otherwise.
Yeah. I think people, if you've read any like the introduction to my or preface to my book or something, you know that I kind of took I went to to Marx's work and looked at his methodological theory, which I think and that kind of influenced my work at the time. And I think one key element in Marx's work was that he went back to the premises of things. What exists? What is behind what we are seeing that pre-existed and it came out of, and therefore it influences. And the way that anthropology has been studying, we look at things kind of immediately without. Just wondering, do people hear me without that? Okay. It's kind of disturbing to me to listen to myself. And so that Marx, in all his work, he was always looking for the underlying premises. Is what
if things exist, what do they depend on in the world for them to exist? And what happened in the past that brought you up to that point? And so and the way that I've been taught anthropology, and maybe it's all changed by this time, anthropology was very empirical. It was, you look at things and you observe them, and then that's reality or something. But Marx looked at things and he saw what's behind the immediate reality, and what does it depend on, and what did it came out of. And so that, for me, when I went to Bandipur and I saw that merchants had been doing business there since, like, the people had moved out of Bhaktapur just after the time of Prithvi Narayan's conquest of Bhaktapur, and they'd gone into a lot of the hill towns, east and west. And in Bandipur, they'd been doing business in India for a long time, since early 19th century at least. And so then what does that mean when they're doing business in India? And they happen to be trading in industrial produced cloths and cottons and other goods that were coming out of Britain at that time. Britain started doing the cloth production in 1795. And so then what does it mean then to be buying goods and bringing them into the countryside and moving wealth out of the country to buy these goods? And to start becoming part of the circulation of commodities in the global capitalist economy. And so anyway, that's kind of the focus that I took. And then in that, then if you're going to be involved in such trade and intercourse, it means also that things have to substantially change in the countryside. And so that's the kind of things I was looking at. And then also in the Marxist method, they had what people saw it as people have said, that Marx was dialectical. It came out of the Hegelian thought. And dialectic depends on a dualism that sees you have one form and it interacts with another form, and then out of that you get a new form, a synthesis out of that process. And it's a very dualistic process, or at least how it's been described, it's very dualistic. It means you have one thing and then a second thing, and out of that comes merging into a third thing. And the third kind of element was that Marx, you see something this specific, and then you move from that into the general or the abstract, and then you come back to the reality and deal with it in terms of this larger understanding that you had. So those were kind of the three elements. And should I go into where I went from there?
So has it evolved over the years? Your methodology, your methodological concerns or usage, has it evolved over the years? Or
yeah, it has.
Is it the same?
Yeah, it has. In fact, just in 1983, the first of Marx's late notebooks started coming out, and so we saw that Marx himself had evolved. And the first of those notebooks is his ethnological notebooks, which then I read, and he saw something quite different. He's instead of seeing things in terms of one thing leading to the next, he saw that was looking through the societies throughout the world, North Americans, and at that time he was also reading like 200 books in Russian on the Russian commune, and he was reading everything that was coming out of India at that time. And so he started seeing things not so much in this linear kind of fashion, from one thing to the next, but that there's a coming together of many different things, and there's also many different possibilities. For example, he saw the Native Americans in North America. They had very strong communal systems of organizing, and so these gave a kind of new idea from the previous ideas of what he had for communism at that time. And then later on in his works, which I've been reading more recently, he started reading in ecology and agriculture. And in fact, that's why he never finished his books in Capital, when in his later age, because he's doing all this reading into other things, and Ingalls was quite pissed off. He said, "I wish I could burn all those notebooks that he had." And so, you know, how does our living in the world depend upon how the nature is organized in the world, and then how are we changing it through capitalism? And he got an idea that there's a break in the metabolism of the world. He called it a metabolic rift that capitalism was causing. And also he looked at agriculture and was looking at how agriculture would be changed by capitalism. So anyway, I've gone from much more of a linear kind of thinking to seeing how things are converging. And then recently, in the last 10 years or so, I happened to go to this place called the Land Institute, and they're very much influenced by a different philosopher. His name is Alfred North Whitehead, and I would say he's a Hegel of the 20th century, whereas like Marx was influenced by Hegel, and this new philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, he went much back to the very premises of thought and how our thought developed from the early Greek times, and how each time that some new idea came, then what was lost out of that new idea coming. And so I guess later on we'll get to that.
Yeah, so this is very interesting because from your methodological, how you've evolved over the last few years.
Yeah.
You also, in the 1990s, especially when the Jan Andolan was going on, you were here and you've critiqued the analysis or the usage of that movement as movement for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
It was a people's movement, it was a Jan Andolan, but to call it Loktantrik, you thought it was doing injustice to the actual practice of democracy. किनभने उहाँको चाहिँ क्रिटिक के थियो भने त्यसलाई लोकतान्त्रिक आन्दोलन भनिए पनि जबसम्म वास्तव प्रड्युस गर्ने उत्पादन गर्ने मान्छेहरू चाहिँ पोलिटिकल प्र्याक्टिसमा आउँदैनन् तबसम्म त्यो डेमोक्रेसी हुँदैन र त्यही क्रममा चाहिँ यु क्रिटिक इभन द कम्युनिस्ट पार्टिज फर सर्ट अफ त्यो खुम्चाएको हुनाले त्यो लोकतान्त्रिक अभ्यास अथवा जसले उत्पादन गर्छ उनीहरूलाई चाहिँ त्यो राजनीतिक प्रक्रियामा सामेल हुने परिस्थितिमा चाहिँ त्यसले खुम्चाउने काम चाहिँ कम्युनिस्ट पार्टीहरूले पनि गर्यो। केही हदसम्म अभ्यास भइरहेका जनसरकारहरू जस्तो यो माओवादी कालमा पछि मेरो पुस्तामा आइपुग्दा पनि त्यो रेपिटिसन देखिन्छ। तर तपाईले जुन 46 सालको आन्दोलन ताकाको क्रिटिक गर्दै हुनुहुन्थ्यो त्यो बेला पनि जनसरकारहरूलाई जसरी कोल्याप्स गरियो त्यसलाई क्रिटिक गर्दै यस्ता आधारभूत कुराहरू मा चाहिँ तपाईले प्रश्न उठाउनुहुन्थ्यो र यही गर्ने क्रममा मलाई पनि एउटा इन्ट्रेस्टिङ लागेको चाहिँ यो सार्वभौम सत्ता भन्ने कुरा डेमोक्रेसी बारे तपाईले लेख्नु पनि भएको छ, सोभरेनिटी बारे चाहिँ तपाईले अलिअलि बोल्नु मात्रै भएको छ, लेख्नु भएको छैन। त्यही भएर आज त्यो विषयमा चाहिँ अलिकति जोड्न चाहिँ त्यता खोजेको कि हामीले अहिले पाएको संविधानमा एउटा एकदम ठुलो हामीले छलाङ मारेको फड्को मारेको भनेको सोभरेनिटीको कुरामा हैन कि सोभरेनिटी नाउ लाइज अन द पिपल हैन, सार्वभौम सत्ता सम्पन्न हामी नेपाली भयौं भनेर हामी संविधानमा त लेखेका छौं। तपाईले त्यसलाई चाहिँ कसरी हेर्नुहुन्छ? यो साँच्चै नै एउटा हामीले राजनीतिक रूपमा is it a big political achievement that we've made in terms of making the people sovereign, or do you see something else happening?
Well, my question would be, we say they're sovereign, and the French Constitution, the revolutionary constitutions back in the 18th century said they're sovereign. The American Constitution says people are sovereign. It's kind of like something that, a formula which has to go into each so-called democratic constitution. But then you ask, what's the means in order that people are introduced to sovereignty? Maybe even before that, you can say, what is sovereignty? And this sovereign means king. It means somebody who can make decisions for people without responsibility for them. Somebody who's he makes the laws, but he's the exception to the law. He's not beholden to the law. And we saw that in the kings, and maybe in some of the ministers and prime ministers we see here. We also see this similar kind of thing. So there's a kind of contradiction between even the notion of sovereignty and and democracy. And I don't know, do you see any institutions here that actually involve people into their own decision makings and things? In fact, the Greek word democracy, from ancient Greek, it meant that in the states, that the community itself got together and a whole assembly, and they'd work out the decisions by discussion between all the people in the community, and people would be arguing their points. And the decisions were made by convincing people, not by some kind of political force put on top of them. But what we call democracy now is very different. And part of it is because what has pre-existed any of the revolutions, including the so-called movements in Nepal. There's already great inequality in these societies, and there's already quite a lot of development of bureaucracy, which actually does the ruling of the society.
Yes.
In fact, the Max Weber, the German sociologist Max Weber, he said that the rulers of modern society are the bureaucrats, not the others. The elected officials are atop the bureaucracy, and they're fighting for who goes on top of the bureaucracy. But the actually rulers of the modern society are the bureaucrats. And even the parties are bureaucratic. And you see even all the institutions, the school systems, the education system, the army, the modern army has to be very bureaucratic. And part of it is because the modern state is so complex, it takes a very specialized knowledge to run it. And so that even if you're elected and you're made a minister or something at the top, you don't have that knowledge, and you don't know the means by how the state runs. So there's this whole group of people in between you that are the means that the state runs. And so that these are kind of conditions of the modern society, and we say we're creating a democracy, but yet everything, all this other stuff that exists, in which the society is controlled. And in fact, the philosopher Rousseau, who's seen as a philosopher of the French Revolution, he said that for write one of these democratic constitutions, it would take an entirely new man to make it. And then we write the new constitution, and we expect the new man to be made out of it, even though it's the constitution is written by people who aren't the new men. In fact, you see that in Nepal, the people who wrote the constitution, they've been involved in politics for years and years. And so there's a kind of basic contradiction. How can you make a new man when the old men are making the constitution?
My question or my observation would be, मेरो पनि रिसर्चमा यस्तै खालके कन्सर्नहरू हुन्थ्यो। मैले पनि जनवादको बारेमा र अझ जनवादलाई नयाँ संविधानमा पोलिटिकल इन्स्टिट्युसनको रूपमा अथवा पोलिटिकल प्रोग्रामको रूपमा कसरी संस्थागत गर्ने भन्नेमा मेरो कन्सर्न हुन्थ्यो। त्यो गर्ने क्रममा यस्तो आलोचनाहरू मैले धेरै भेट्टाएँ। यो ब्युरोक्रेटिक भयो, हैन, एउटा फरक इमेजिनेसन चाहिन्छ, फरक अभ्यास चाहिन्छ भन्ने भयो। तर त्यो फरक अभ्यास चाहिँ कस्तो हुने हो भन्ने चाहिँ, जस्तै अब मार्क्सले पनि स्टेटकै बारेमा लेख्छु भन्दै लेखेनन्। अनि अब रोजा लक्जमबर्गको पनि एकदम शार्प आलोचना हुन्थ्यो जुन अभ्यास चाहिँ डेमोक्रेसीको नाममा जुन सोभियत युनियनमा भयो त्यो पनि खासमा डेमोक्रेटिक भएन भन्ने एकदम शार्प क्रिटिक चाहिँ हो। तर अभ्यास के हो त भन्ने क्रममा फेरि उहाँको पनि अल्पायु भयो होला होइन, सी डाइड टु अर्ली, वी कुडन्ट सी द प्र्याक्टिस। सो आजको दिनसम्म पनि यो अल्टरनेटिभ प्र्याक्टिस के हो त, शासन गर्ने। अब कम्युनिटीमा जाने भन्ने खालको त बुझिन्छ होइन तपाईँको कुराबाट। अब हाम्रो जस्तो समाजमा त्यो कम्युनिटीमा आफै पनि अहिले तपाईँले पनि हिन्ट गर्नुभयो, त्यहाँ आफै इक्वालिटी नहुन सक्छ, त्यहाँ आफै भनौँ न लैङ्गिक हिसाबले जातीय हिसाबले त्यो एउटा आइडियल पोइन्ट होइन होइन। सो यु नो के हुन सक्ला त, आई मिन कुनै फर्मुला खोजेको त होइन, बट time and again we come back to this. So what is this new synthesis that can bring about a new practice?
Before we get to that, there have been examples like in recent movements in Latin America under dictatorships where they actually did develop in the communities, they developed community forms of organization and decision making. For example, when Brazil was under the dictatorship from 1965 to 1987, I think, which had been imposed by the United States, as it does. People in that, if you had any leadership like that communist leadership here, they would be immediately killed. And so that communities started organizing where they get together in like neighborhood groups or circles for making decisions. And then those would then elect people to assemblies who would do things, and when they elected people to the assemblies, they would have to do whatever was told in those neighborhood groups. And that they called that consultative democracy, where that ones that all the decisions are made at the very bottom, and then up at the community assemblies, and then the councils above, they have to take the decisions from below, otherwise they could be recalled. And it's also happening right now in southern Mexico. There's a state in southern Mexico, and about 500,000 people, mostly rural peoples and the native-speaking peoples, they've organized into that kind of government consultative democracy where it will take like 3 months for decisions to be made when something is asked, like for the government from above, and they ask, okay, what do you think of that? And it takes like 3 months for it to go through all the local communities. The decision is made, and then it's passed back up again. And so that's a different kind of democracy. It's not really fast, and for international interests that want to go and take over land and things, it's not very effective. From the outside, UN and those people don't see it very effective because they don't get instant decisions. And the decisions usually are in favor of the villages anyway, and not in favor of the people outside. In fact, they don't allow any of the government bureaucracy into the area.
And they still exist?
Yeah, in fact, in the last couple of months, new villages have joined them from the outside. They're expanding. And so that, I mean, my feeling is that this kind of, in fact, well, I'll get to this, or maybe now we can get into this new kind of synthesis.
Yeah, but before we go into the new synthesis, maybe because you talked about land and how in Brazil, community, and basically they're the actual producers, right? Making their own decision.
Yeah.
So, पूर्ण रूपमा हामी सार्वभौम सत्ता सम्पन्न हुनको लागि अथवा भनौँ न यो डेमोक्रेसीमा हामी डेमोक्रेसीको केन्द्रमा चाहिँ हामी छौँ भन्नको लागि चाहिँ जुन एक्चुअल उत्पादनमा संलग्न छन् उनीहरूलाई सहभागी गराउनु पर्यो। त्यसको लागि त उत्पादन गर्ने तरिका पनि बदलिनु पर्यो भन्ने छ नि त तपाईको हैन, by changing also the ways of producing.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? How do you, किनभने हिजो अस्ति मात्रै पनि हामीले देखिरहेका छौँ, तपाईँ त चितवन पनि गइराख्नुहुन्छ हैन, he keeps on going to चितवन, त्यहाँ कृषिसँग संलग्न समुदायसँग मान्छेहरूसँग काम गर्नुहुन्छ। आज पनि आन्दोलन सायद हुनेवाला थियो अथवा हुँदैछ। देशव्यापी रूपमा कृषकहरू आन्दोलनमा छन् र यसो केन्द्रबिन्दुमा तपाईँको रिसर्चमा भनिए चाहिँ यहीँको आन्तरिक डाइनामिक्स पनि छ, सँगसँगै इन्टरनेसनल ट्रेड मार्केटसँगको यसको सम्बन्ध पनि छ। सो वाट इज दिस न्यू what are the new ways of producing?
Okay, well, but I've also gotten involved in, or at least familiar with, in the last 10 years. In America, you know, everything's totally controlled by capitalism, right from the top down to the bottom. And all the trade and commerce and everything, and the rural society has been totally destroyed. There used to, 100 years ago, 70% of the population was farmers. Now it's less than 1% in the United States. And so how can you change, how can you confront that? And even now it's getting even worse. Big corporations are setting up gigantic factory-like farms on the countryside, and there's almost no farmers left. And all the workers are coming from outside, from Mexico and other places. So, and all the villages, all the towns and villages, most of them are gone. And there used to be a whole system of school, university, colleges, liberal arts colleges in the rural countryside. And those are all going bankrupt now because there's no students to come to those colleges. So how can you start changing these things? And the other big problem is in agriculture itself, that this industrial agriculture is so exploiting the soil that you're getting tremendous erosion, and then all the fertility is going out of the soil, and it won't be long before there's no ability to farm anymore. That the aquifers are being sucked up by what do you call it? You know, the water is being pumped out of the ground, and the aquifers are being sucked up. And in fact, much of the American agriculture and even European agriculture and Chinese, they're all going and cutting down the rainforests in Brazil in order to produce their soybeans and corn and cattle. And if you look in in China, the 50 years ago, there was no delta, no, on the ocean, the edge of the ocean was like that. Now that land is extended out 100 miles out into the sea from all the topsoil that's gone out and been washed away into the sea. And so how do we confront that? And so there's a geneticist and ecologist who was at the University of Santa Cruz in the 1960s. He started their ecology department, but he was also a farmer in Kansas, which is a state in the middle of the U.S., and a lot of farming. And so after a couple of years of teaching ecology, he's thinking, here we have a big problem that we're losing all our topsoil, especially with all the machines and things. The topsoil is washed away. And in another 50 or 100 years, all the topsoil on this planet is going to be gone at the rate that the topsoil is being lost. We're losing all our fertility. So he said, why is this happening? And so he looked back at the problem of agriculture way back into the past. And that problem is that the kind of plants that we domesticated and are using, we're using the annual plants, you know, that you have to plant every year, and then you have to plow down the land, you have to take out the ecosystems, and so the soil is all left uncovered, and the soil blows away and is washed away. And this has been a problem from when agriculture was invented. And if you look where agriculture was first invented in the world, in the Middle East, in the Tigris and Euphrates River, in those areas, it's all desert now. The trees, there used to be forests around the whole Mediterranean, and those are all cut down. And so humans basically been, with their agriculture and their systems of living, which came out of that, from 10,000 years ago, they've been taking the carbon out of the ground, out of the ecosystems, and been exploiting it. And so wherever agriculture has gone, deserts have gone. So then they looked okay, what's the premise of this? You know, we go back to how Marx looked at the premises, and they saw that we're using the annual plants, and in their whole role in nature, the annual plants come in and they if there's been a forest fire or if a landslide or a flood, the annual and the trees and the bushes and the ecosystems are washed away. The annual plants in nature, they come and fill it up. But then they're very quickly replaced by perennial plants. Those are our weeds that we're always fighting against. And the perennial plants, they have really deep roots and they hold the soil and they build the soil. And so they said, why did we not have an agriculture that used perennial plants?
We don't know what perennial plants are.
Perennial plant. Perennial means it lives from year to year. It's like, you know, your grassland, you go and look in the grassland. It's the same plants, so they're all this year and the next year and the next year, and they produce seed each year. Is that a good explanation, or maybe you can explain it better?
के भन्ने नेपालीमा के भन्छ मलाई नि?
हरेक वर्ष रोप्नु नपर्ने प्लान्टलाई पेरिनियल प्लान्ट भन्छ।
Like coffee. So
Yeah.
But it's also, if you look at a forest, the trees are perennial. They don't grow every year.
Trees, we do not plant every year.
Right, right. And there's also shrubs and things too. There's also grasses. There's wheat grasses. There's every kind of grain that we have. There's a perennial version. But why were these not domesticated? And it's because of this different role in nature. They're in a place where there's a lot of plants, and they have to hold on to the soil. And if they put seeds out, there's already many plants there, it will be waste of energy. So the seeds are kind of an afterthought. They're small, they don't have much energy. And if there's any stress on the plants, they'll drop the seeds. Whereas the annuals, they put all their energy into producing seeds. So that made the perfect thing for domesticating. And that's it. Even when the annuals were wild, that's what they would eat. They would burn the area, and then the annuals would come, and then they'd eat the seeds back 10,000 years ago before agriculture. And so they thought, oh, okay, why weren't they domesticated? And the biggest problem is they're genetically very difficult. They crossbreed with each other, or the annuals can self-breed. If you can breed back on yourself, you can domesticate them, you can select for different traits. But if the plants crossbreed, then they keep on picking up new mutations, which you don't want in your plants. So it's very hard to domesticate them. And so they thought, now we have the genetic knowledge, the ecological knowledge, we can domesticate the perennial plants. So they thought to try to do that. And now they have many plants, wheat, sorghum, rice, and in Japan and China, they're working with groups to...
This is the Land Institute.
Yeah, the Land Institute. This place that this ecologist established back in 1970 or whenever. And so now they're domesticating these. And the other big problem is that these plants, they grow in very ecologically complex situations. They grow with many other different plants. So then you have to make an agriculture also that grows with many other different plants. So that needs a lot of ecological knowledge. And so now, I mean, they successfully have domesticated, they made big seed, and they found out they can still have all the perennial characteristics. They grow from year to year. And in China already, the rice, it produces as much as the rice here. The roots are from the ceiling, and they're about this thick, each plant. And now there's 45,000 farmers in China already, within 4 years, 45,000 farmers growing the perennial rice. And in the US, are working on 1 million farmers, 1 million acres, sorry. And they're working all across the northern grain belt. And then they have many other perennials, and then there's institutes in many countries that are working with developing these perennials. But then because it's ecologically complex, it also means that you need a whole different way of living in the world, of relating to nature, of seeing everything as one system of many different plants and things, and seeing you have to kind of have an ecosystem view of the world rather than dividing the world all up in fact, our science, from the very early times, our science divided the world up into pieces and thought that we would understand by seeing the pieces, and we cut the pieces smaller and smaller until they're, it's subatomic pieces that we're looking for. But then the meaning, you don't really understand much of how the whole thing works if you're looking at the pieces. And that's why we're also destroying our world, because we're cutting everything to pieces, thinking that it won't matter to the whole world if we cut everything into little pieces. And so we need a whole different way, different philosophical system, and different worldview of seeing the world and interacting with the world. So another thing along with this domestication, they're creating this new man that Rousseau talked about 200 or 300 years ago. And they're doing this by developing a whole new curriculum in school. They call it ecospheric, meaning the living earth. Ecosphere is the living earth, everything that's living and not living on the whole earth that's interacting. That's called the ecosphere. And so they're creating a whole ecosphere curriculum in which all our learning is informed by our relationship to the world as a whole. And then the way that we're going, it's the only way in the end that we're going to survive in the world if we start going by nature. They call it farming. They call it farming in nature's image, and they call it nature as measure. The measure of everything has to be by nature itself if we're going to live on this world. The world, nature herself, she created us. She created all the life in the world, and if we're all dependent upon it, and if we're dependent upon the whole thing, we're dependent on all the animals. We can't just take, okay, here's the animals we want, and then the rest we get rid of. We're dependent upon all of them. So this depends, we have to kind of develop a way of living as nature is measure. And so that this is a way that they're creating the new man. And in the Americas, they're going and taking over a lot of the towns that have been abandoned by farmers. They're starting to resettle people on the land. They have a whole school system where you don't divide things up, you bring it all together. And this division, in fact, the word science means to cut. And you can see how it's such a part of all our thinking.
सो क्वेसन आन्सर भन्दा अगाडि मलाई लागेको थोरै कुरा अब अलि we now have to wrap up.
Okay.
What do you want to say? So do you want to मैले त धेरै नै प्यारलल देखेँ हैन नेपालकै सन्दर्भमा पनि हामीले धेरै समयमा आफै राजनीति गर्नु भएको नाताले पनि राजनीतिक प्रक्रियामा राजनीतिक गतिविधिमा हैन सत्तामा के भइरहेको छ संविधानमा के लेखिरहेका छौँ कानुन कस्तो बन्दैछ भन्नेमा नै हाम्रो धेरै जसो समय गइरहेको हुन्छ उहाँको ध्यानाकर्षण गराउने कुरा चाहिँ सबै चिज कसरी अन्तर्सम्बन्धित छ र मैले लोकतन्त्र सार्वभौम सत्ता जस्ता एकदम दार्शनिक र व्यवहारिक कुराहरू पनि गरिरहँदा त्यो एक्चुअल मान्छे किन हामी दैनिक रूपमा आम मान्छे त केही न केही उत्पादनमै जोडिरहेका हुन्छौँ नि हाम्रो खानेदेखि लिएर हैन हाम्रो दैनिक दिनचर्याको काममा उत्पादनसँग त जोडिएकै हुन्छौँ तर त्यो कार्य आफै चाहिँ हाम्रो राजनीतिक त्यो विमर्शमा चाहिँ त्यसले ठाउँ पाइरहेको हुँदैन सो उहाँले चाहिँ त्यसलाई एकदम केन्द्रमा ल्याइराख्नु भएको हुँदा अब यो नयाँ सिन्थेसिस नयाँ संश्लेषण चाहिँ कस्तो देख्नुहुन्छ नेपालको सन्दर्भमा हाउ डु यु सी इट happening and because there is a contradiction as you already said हैन नयाँ कन्स्टिट्युसन बनाउनको लागि नयाँ मान्छे चाहिन्छ भनिन्छ तर त्यो नयाँ मान्छे कसरी बन्छ भन्दाखेरि त्यो नयाँ व्यवस्थाले नै त्यो कुनै अर्को प्लानेटबाट आउने त होइन भएकै उपलब्ध चिजबाटै नयाँ ह्युमन बिइङ बन्ने हो सो यो बीचको यो ट्रान्जिसन फेजमा हामी छौँ के र मलाई सबैभन्दा इन्ट्रेस्टिङ लाग्ने नै यो ट्रान्जिसन फेज हो जब ठ्याक्क पुरानो पनि सबै नयाँ भइसकेको छैन र नयाँ पनि पूर्ण रूपमा नयाँ हुन सकिरहेको छैन यस्तो फेजमा चाहिँ तपाईँले भनिराख्नु भएको यो जमिनको कुरा प्रोडक्सनको कुरा कन्स्टिट्युसनको कुरा यो नयाँ what is this new synthesis that we can see happening in Nepal?
Well, our problems are scale. We've made things bigger and bigger and bigger scale. They're bringing all the water in from the rivers and from outside the valley into the valley they've moved all the population and every solution is a bigger solution. We have to make big dams and things. The problem is when you have big problems, it doesn't work to solve them with big solutions. It's going to take a lot of work in many localities and with many different inputs according to the needs of every single locality. And so the solutions are going to have to be many and they're going to have to be more and more and have to be small. And that's the whole kind of emphasis of the Land Institute too. And in fact, they say we can't prescribe the things because each location has its own problems, its own possibilities, and its own needs and things. And it's going to have to come out of each location and be worked on. And that's a lot of this whole new education system they're building. They have many different places where they learn, like at the Lands Institute, and there's a place called the Wendell-Berry Institute, and there's a college called anyway, there's a college up in the Northeast where their one major is ecology, and they're also started a program educating 50 farmers a year, and they're going to set them up on land around the U.S. and develop them. And then each location, they'll have to work with in order to fix it on its own terms. We have to fix everything on their nature's own terms, the world's own terms.
So sort of not a university, but I think, what do you call it?
It's called many different centers. I mean,
Polyversity.
That's a Nepali guy. He got that same idea, maybe from the
Nepali
same
guy?
people. Yeah.
He did what?
Promote Potter Julie, but he's never come back to Nepal. He works in an American college, but he got the idea of something called polyversity, where you'd have one learning center in the hills, one in the high mountains, one in the lowlands, maybe a number of them around the country. And then the students, they may want to learn one thing here that's related to the situation in Chautari, and then maybe there's some problem and they need some ideas from another location where they're doing things differently. So then the student can go there and study. In fact, that's what the Land Institute is doing. Sterling College is the college they're working with. And then they're taking all the old, those liberal arts colleges, as I said, and they're developing new education centers. And each one, and it all depends, it's all oriented towards that location that they're in. And then you bring through all kinds of knowledges. You don't have knowledge all split up like in the university that we have. That's something that's only arisen in the last 600 years or so. Before, knowledge wasn't so split up. And in the early Greek thought, all knowledge was kind of together and seen as one thing. In fact, all science is ultimately based on philosophy, in which all knowledge is one thing.
Should we ask for questions?
Okay.
Okay, thank you so
There's so
much.
many different. I'm just learning this myself, so I hope it makes some sense.
यहाँको केही प्रश्न छ केही भन्न मन लागेको छ भने
And that,
उहाँले बुझ्नुहुन्छ फर्काउन पनि सक्नुहुन्थ्यो अहिले अलि अभ्यास कम भएको हुनाले
and बुझेन भने प्रश्न सोध्छु.
धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद. अङ्ग्रेजी नेपाली मिलाएर बोल्छु है.
हुन्छ हुन्छ.
पहिलो कुरा त यो सार्वभौमसत्तामा को कुरा चाहिँ गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ मलाई चाहिँ अवतार सिंह सिन्धुपासको चाहिँ एउटा चाहिँ कपलेटको एउटा लाइन चाहिँ याद आउँछ कि उसले चाहिँ भनेको सांसद चाहिँ उल्लु बनाउनेहरूको प्रयोगशाला हो भनेर क्या. द पार्लियामेन्ट is an experiment to make the people fool every time in every election, in every year, and things like this.
Yeah.
So that was the essence of that. And of course, Avtar Singh Sindhupas was a little bit radical left and some movement. So, but that line was interesting. So why I was telling you that line was because we have a delegated. We don't believe. I have a doubt that whether we are sovereign in Nepal or not, because we think that we have delegated our sovereignty to the parliament.
Yeah.
And this parliament, as you rightly said, has become a bureaucrat.
Right.
And and my another friend Mahesh Raj was a friend who is like doing a research in the land, and he calls one Nepal has become a Dalal society. And
what
then,
society?
Dalal society.
Oh, Dalal, yeah.
Broker
Contractors.
society.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he was referring to the idea that how the parliamentarian has become a broker between the state, Rajya, and it's a corporate, and the people.
That's
Because
right.
between them, parliamentarian, we believe that we have delegated our sovereignty to them and then to take every decision that they want.
Right.
But then ultimately they have become a broker in a way. Dalal, we can get to another nice sophisticated word for a parliamentarian because parliamentarians are
Yeah.
very, but then
Honorable.
but then it अहिले चाहिँ बुझ्नको लागि दलाल, they are dalal in the sense.
That's fine.
Then we thought that in India experimented was a panchayat system.
Yeah.
That the parliament has become too much of a power, so now the panchayat system will delegate more of the sovereignty to the people so that they can take. In Nepal, we also believe that local government when came, that at least they will have some, they will succeed from the stupidity of the dalals in the Kathmandu and do the things of their own. But then we see that now mayor, what are they called, also become bureaucrat.
Yeah.
Of what kind?
In fact, they're sending the bureaucracy down with
Yes,
all the
yes.
Nagar.
So it has
Yeah.
become, so we see from all the layers of the government, the dalals everywhere. And then the sovereignty is somewhere missing in between.
Right.
So
Well, actually, the whole word sovereignty, and sovereign means king, is a contradiction to keep. If you have a community making its own decisions, nothing is sovereign. They're making their own decisions, and it's just something entirely different. In Greek, they called it isocracy, which means rule of equals, and that was in the very early Greek city-states.
yeah, and then I will conclude.
Right.
Then now we have this broker society everywhere in
Right.
all the three government levels,
Yeah.
and there's literally a dalal. And after that, what happens is the problem is that we are always fed with the definition that the democracy, no matter how worse it is, the democracy is the only best institution, and then we keep running our wheels with that kind of narrative.
Yeah.
So, can you like suggest us some ways at least to I don't know, त्यसलाई संकुचन त्यो दलाललाई चाहिँ अलिकति संकुचनमा चाहिँ गर्ने to control that dalals in a bit so that they will not do brokerage of a kind that we would like त्यो दलालहरूलाई नै अलिकति शक्ति जस्तो सन्तुलन गर्न सक्ने कुनै निकाय छ कि भन्ने चाहिँ that's the question.
Yeah. Well, how come everybody's sitting here in Kathmandu?
Sorry?
No, and I'll tell you a story about, there's a country called Nicaragua in Central America. And it had had a dictator who was kept in power, and then his son by the American government. Somoza was his name. And in around 1965 or 67 or something, 15 people went into 15 different villages there. And one group of them organized, or actually there are several things happening. One group is organizing the military uprising. The second group, which I wouldn't recommend, but I'll get to that later, at this point anyway. Another group went into the villages and they were organizing them to start taking over decision-making for themselves. And one person each in 15 different villages, and they were totally isolated and alone. And within like 7 years, they overthrew the entire government, supported by the U.S. And that's because they worked very closely in each village. In China also, the Chinese Revolution, they say Mao made the revolution, but actually it was people working in villages. They didn't even know that they were communists. You don't have to be communist or whatever either. And but like I said, you take a big problem, you're going to have to work on it in small ways. It means, and maybe make a kind of education system like the Land Institute is doing, which gets young people out into the different villages. And I tell you, the Land Institute, when I first went there, 200 people would come to every year they have a big thing they call festival, they call it the Prairie Festival. And in the first Prairie Festival, before I came, there were 200 young people out of 2,000. And the one that I came to, there were 800 young people out of 4,000 people who were coming. And now that's half young people. So they're getting these young people involved and getting them out onto the countryside and working. And with this entirely new way of thinking, and the young people are really very, very excited about it, because it's, you know, if you're young nowadays, and even if you're old like me, you can see there's really problems in the world, and it's our whole human survival in the world is in question. And we're going to have to fix it, you know, and from starting in small things, not with some big solution that's going yeah. And regarding that, oh wow.
Another question.
Okay.
म चाहिँ जग्गा प्रशासनमै काम गर्छु।
जग्गा प्रशासन।
हजुर। मेरो प्रश्न चाहिँ के छ भने
He works in land governance.
हाम्रो चाहिँ उत्पादकको त्यो घटिरहेको छ। वर्षेनी हामी 2 खर्बभन्दा बढीको आयात गर्छौँ। तर हाम्रो उत्पादकत्व बढाउने विषयमा चाहिँ यहाँको केही आइडिया, केही सजेसनहरू छ भने
He's saying our productivity is decreasing.
Yeah.
So what do you say about increasing the productivity?
Well, it's not going to be increased by the old methods, because, for example, you mean in the soil or altogether? Yeah.
तपाईले भन्न खोज्नु भएको माटोबाट
Because
as
as a whole system.
Yeah, as a whole system.
आज हिजो आज मात्रै पनि आइरहेको थियो धनकुटामा सधैँ भइराख्ने सुन्तला अब यो वर्ष चाहिँ हैन भएन र त्यो पछाडीको कारण चाहिँ यस्तै माटोको फर्टिलाइजरको अनि के कारण अथवा यो क्लाइमेट चेन्जको कारण हो
के छ भने अहिले प्रति हेक्टर उत्पादकको 3.2 मेट्रिक टन छ। इन्डियामा हामीसँगै जोडिएको उत्तर प्रदेशमा चाहिँ 4 मेट्रिक टन प्रति हेक्टर छ हैन। अब यको उत्पादक त्यसैमाथि हाम्रो 60% ओभर पपुलेसन चाहिँ हामी कृषिमा काम गरिरहेका छौँ। तर त्यसको प्रोडक्टिभिटी कति छ भने हाम्रो जिडिपीको 23.7%। हामी उत्पादन र उत्पादकत्व बढाउने यहाँसँग केही आइडिया छ।
So what is the idea here now? What's the current idea? What is the current?
नेपालमा अहिले के समाधान निकाल्न खोजिरहेको छ त भन्ने सोध्नु भएको छ सरकारको तर्फबाट। हैन नेपाल सरकारको त्यस्तो कुनै योजना आएको छ कि छैन भन्ने।
धेरै नै आइडियाहरू छ, धेरै नै पोलिसीहरू छ, काम गरिरहेको छ। तर आउटपुट चाहिँ देखिरहेको छैन। किनकि हामी चाहिँ अब डिपेन्डेन्सी हाम्रो बढिरहेको छ। त्यसैमाथि यहाँको जुन टपिक छ सार्वजनिक सत्ता नै हाम्रो उत्पादनसँग जोडिएको छ। भोलि हाम्रोमा आयात काहीँ ब्लक भयो भने हाम्रो आफ्नो सार्वजनिक सत्ताको साथी नै कसरी बुझाउनु पर्ने हो कि भन्ने स्थितिमा पुगिरहेको छ। त्यस कारणले यो उत्पादकत्व बढाउने विषयमा चाहिँ यहाँको अध्ययन के छ?
So here mainly I'm from मैले देखेको चाहिँ बढी अनुदानका प्याकेजहरू यो इन्करेज गर्ने कुरा अथवा उत्पादकको अर्को इन्फ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्टहरू हैन इरिगेसन प्रोजेक्टहरू हैन यस्तो माध्यमबाट चाहिँ प्रोत्साहित गर्ने कार्यक्रमहरू चाहिँ हामी देख्छौँ नेपालमा। बट स्टिल उहाँको भनाइअनुसार 60% भन्दा माथि कृषिमा निर्भर छौँ, काम गर्छौँ, तर हाम्रो उत्पादकत्व एकदम कम छ। सो तपाईको विचारमा अरु के हुन सक्छ विकल्पहरू?
Well, I think I take the Land Institute's perspective, and what they say is the way that we're trying to fix it now are in terms of problems in agriculture. And as I said before, the Land Institute sees it as a problem of agriculture. And it's become so bad because we've so much expanded the agriculture. We're taking out all the ecosystems. We're pushing the land to its most, more trying to get more and more out of the land. using the same kind of methods, using the same kind of plants. And so what they see it as, it's a problem of agriculture, and of agriculture meaning the whole system of agriculture. And so what they see, we have to change the whole, you could say, the hardware of the agriculture, the plants and the seed. And in fact, there's somebody here in Nepal, he's working with the perennial wheat. And
Wheat?
Wheat, yeah. And he's developing it. And you know, the perennials, they have to fit into the local conditions, so you have to develop them. And it's also very much of a knowledge-based agriculture. Your packages that you're getting from the overseas, those are technology-based. And in fact, they totally ignore the local conditions and situations. What they say is you have to put in the inputs, the required amount of inputs, and it doesn't matter how the land lives and works before that. You have to come in and make a kind of system that's very uniform in order for the agriculture to work, and that destroys the lands. In fact, if you take in the Native American agriculture, there's 3 plants, corn, beans, and squash, were domesticated in the Americas. And they're very productive. The way that the Native Americans grew them is very productive. It's twice as productive as the way that they're grown in fields here. We have corn separate, beans separate, and squash separate. And when they have them together, it makes the productivity almost twice as much, just normally. In some corn systems in Mexico, it produces 12 times as much. That's from 400, 500-year-old systems. And when you put chemicals on it one time, one season, it takes at least 10 years to recover. And there's a farmer in the Chitwan, he's turned to organic, and after about 16 years using chemicals, and then his soil became like cement, and then he shifted to organic. And even 25 years after he started going organic, he gets very good production and stuff, but he has like the old rices. He's growing 150 varieties of rice alongside his farms. And he's distributing the seeds to farmers. But Nepal had these wonderful rices that have really good smell and taste. And he said that even after 25 years, the smell and taste haven't recovered because it's destroyed. All the relationships in the soil have been destroyed. And so that using this kind of the big systems, the packages and things are not going to work for helping us because they're trying to fix this problem, that problem, but they're not dealing with the whole problem of the agriculture. And that's what we're going to be forced to be dealing with. And that growing the perennial grains is you're modeling the whole system on the natural ecosystems. And they call that nature is measure, as I said. So anyway, that's what I would say you have to, and it's going to be very locally based. Each local situation is going to be different. Even in the traditional systems of agriculture, like in Southeast Asia, they had like 15 different, or in Mexico, or Peru, any farmer would grow 15 different kinds of, at least 15 different kinds of potatoes. Here we grow how many? 2 or 4 maybe. And each field, depending whether it's high or low or tilted towards the sun or away from the sun, you're going to have a different kind of potato in it. And so that the farmers had a tremendous knowledge of their land, and they would adjust the whole farming system according to their land. And what we're being taught now is you bring in this uniform thing. If it's not working, you add more water or add more chemical of this. And you're bringing in more and more costs to the farmer. And that's how all the American farmers are pushed off the land. They all went bankrupt. In the 1970s, there were 20,000 farmers a month going bankrupt. And it just emptied out the land of farmers. If you go on this outside system, that's going to happen to your land. It's already happening. You're losing your agricultural population.
Thank you. My question is about sovereignty. Maybe a bit theoretical, but I think we have entered, or probably just entering right now, into this whole new domain of digital sovereignty and that kind of transcend our traditional understanding of territorial sovereignty in a way. I guess my question is, do you see, and you talked about this creation of a new land, do you think this process to be constructivist, or is it, or how elitist do you think this is?
Elitist.
Yeah, a good example, of course, is our own Nepal's political transformation, how a new constitution was written by just a handful of people. So what do you say about this whole, you said creation of a new ecosphere that we are entering?
Well, okay. That, at least my observance too, also similar to yours, in 1990, I saw that there's this tremendous involvement of all the peoples in the villages and every place that were involved in the movement. And then the moment they made this settlement with the king, they everybody was demobilized, taken out. You don't have a role anymore. Now it's a group of specialists and international advisors and lawyers who were going to make the Constitution. And basically, if you, I don't know, I've compared it, maybe I did not look close enough, but basically all the constitutions, like the royal constitution before, they're very similar. And even the notion of sovereignty, if you look at this recent constitution, at least what I've seen is everything for the president is the king, except for maybe 2 different points. And so you really haven't gotten any transformation. And part of that is because the people who are the leaders, the political leaders, they're very scared of the people in the countryside. And if they had actually, like, they arranged for shipping the people out of the countryside rather than solving their problems. Because if they had solved the problems, it would mean giving over power and self-decision making to the people in the local levels, and then the people at the top will not be so important anymore. And this has been very common in different revolutions. In the American Revolution, which is the first one of these modern constitutions, the revolution itself to separate from the British is being pushed by the landless and the small farmers. And there's a whole organization, I forgot the name, kind of party or political force. And it was very strong, and all the leaders who we call the fathers of the country, like they, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all those people, and the merchants and the bureaucrats, they were really scared of having the power go to these people. So they, right to the end, they wanted to stay with the king. They wanted to make arrangements in which they could keep the king. But when the power from the bottom became too much, then these people are very clever or expert in politics. They're the so-called leaders. So then they took over the leadership of the revolution, and then kind of controlled it, so they wouldn't be kicked out. And then afterwards, these small farmers and people that were heavily in debt, and they'd taken the burden of the fighting, they'd taken the cost of the revolution onto themselves, so they were all heavily in debt, as they were before even. And so then they started a whole new uprising. It was called Shays Uprising. And this is before the Constitution was written. It was after the revolution. The political leaders, they thought they would each keep their separate kind of states as where they would have control over. But when this big revolution came, that was called the Shays Rebellion, they used the army that they used in the revolution against the British and used that to suppress, and they killed a lot of the people. And then they got so scared they made the Constitution for a central government which could control things. And the same thing happened in all the French revolutions. And in the revolution, the first revolution, the big French Revolution we learned about in our school books, there are many, many communes. That's where Marx got the word communist. And they're communes meaning assemblies of the workers in which they were controlling their workplaces, they're controlling the neighborhoods, their villages, everything. And when the revolution finished, they disbanded all these communes. And the same thing happened again in 1848 when they had another revolution. And they got rid of the king, and eventually 4 years later, the king was back again. And then in 1871, the same thing, that they kicked the entire government out, and they had a government called the Commune. in Paris, and it was based on all the workers' communes. And then that French government, which was destroyed, it got the German army to come in and conquer for them. The Germans weren't very happy with it. They saw what they're having to do. And in Nepal, even in 1950, 50 revolution, you had a lot of the Jana Sarkar and all that kind of urban centers being formed with their own armies, Jana Sarkar Army Hari. And these, like in Bandipur, there's many of the urban areas, and they, like that army in Bandipur drove out the Rana troops, the army in Pokhara drove out the army troops. When the army came back and took the barracks, then the army from Bandipur went to Pokhara and drove the troops out again. And then after the settlement with the king, BP Korala, he called for all those governments to be disbanded.
Jan Sarkars.
Yeah, because his idea was that party would come in, it would get the control of the central government, and everything would go good for them. And so they got rid of the Jana Sarkar, they took the soldiers out, and they promised the soldiers that they'd be incorporated into the main army. And they took them out, and the soldiers got way out in the east. The soldiers got disappointed because nothing was happening. They got demoralized, and they returned back to their towns. And then what it meant was there's no force left anymore when BP Korala was trying to negotiate government, there's no force behind him on which he could base himself on. But it would have meant being much less powerful than he was expected. And then we know the history after that.
We'll take a question.
Yeah. So my question is from the botanical ecosystem perspective. So how do you?
Which perspective?
From the perspective of a botanical, from the botanical ecosystem you talked about,
right.
you discussed
Yeah.
in length. I have noted a few things down, and maybe in disagreement, or maybe I choose to believe I understood a little about it. That how do you prove the same generic idea in regard to the coniferous or the deciduous ecosystem? I mean, the same idea of propagation of biomes that does not function the way I think the way you talked about. The way you generalized maybe, and how do your ideas converge at one point, for instance, and how even the sense of belonging to the land for the farmers residing in those areas, and that use the groups that use the land for the means of as the means of production that otherwise would have been a means of production be substantiated in your theory, and or say the drought in the plains, you cannot change it, where you cannot change a thing because you have no access to irrigation facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to also add to that, are you taking climate change as a point of consideration, and are genetically modified produces also the factors or attributes that define the way you talked about the biomes or genomes? Or did you consider them in your study, and do you not think this in a way lead to a prolonged systemic injustice happening in the region?
Mm-hmm.
I think I tried putting my question that way. Thank you.
Could you just say simply what you think is the problem of what I said?
Yeah, I mean, the biomes we've considered where, I would love to know where, for instance, you said you have been to Chitwan, and do your findings also reflect to the coniferous or the deciduous ecosystem that a major part of the country, resides at or relies on, for instance,
Well,
for the means of production?
Well, what I've observed in Chitwan is that the agriculture is being, the land is being all plotted up and taken over and sold off, and so that agriculture is disappearing. Even the farm, I lived on a farm with that organic farmer for a year, and even around, I came back this time, I didn't recognize the way there even, and And there's still a lot of open land around, and so I said, is it not being plotted? And he said, yeah, it's all being plotted and being taken over. And
I think
so,
what she was,
yeah.
she's wondering if you're making a very generic, argument.
Yeah, I am in a way, but the solution has to be specific. It has to be each location, and it has to be developed here. And that's kind of the way the
Is
land
it connected? Because I have something connected to say to this. Do you want to just ask?
No, it's not exactly connected.
Oh, so my thing was, so you're thinking of going back to say a couple of hundred
No,
years.
you can't go back.
You can't go back,
No,
but the
it's all-
knowledge that is there, or the ecosystem. You're
We're
talking
even
about the
having to-
original
We're
ecosystem.
even having to relearn the knowledge, because all our agriculture, we're losing it. We're losing all this knowledge of how to live in each particular place. And like, for example, I went up to Kakani, and some girls I met, they're coming out of school, and so then for the next couple of weeks they took me into the forest and stuff, and they knew all the different, they're teenagers, and they knew hundreds of different plants. They knew all the medicinal uses, and so there's this tremendous knowledge about the land. And then the small scale, the farming that we've been doing, even with its flaws, has a lot of genetic information too in the seeds. Like in Nepal, there's 200, 300, 400, 500 different kinds of rice were grown at one time. Now it's all disappearing because it's being replaced by this modified.
But then
rice.
I'm just wondering,
But-
our history is also a history of poverty, of
Yeah.
malnourishment, of hunger, of rural exploitation,
That's true. That's
and
true.
all of that. So we're not, because you obviously think everything is interconnected. So
Yeah.
it's not just the land,
Right,
it's
exactly.
the relation between
Yeah.
the people and the land.
Yeah.
And so at times, does it sound a bit like, are we valorizing what happened? Isn't it a bit complicated?
Certainly,
Are
my-
we romanticizing it?
No.
And I'm
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that we're pushing ourselves in the earth, that the whole earth as an ecosystem is collapsing. Every single ecosystem biome in the earth is degraded, and vast amounts. The rainforests are being cut down and things. The whole planet depends upon life. For each thing in the planet, including us, it depends on this planet having integrity. And so it's going to be forced onto us, and so that we have to figure out the ways in order to confront it. And so the Land Institute says we have to take, they use that word, nature as measure. The measure of all things, whether it's viable, it has to be worked on nature's terms.
major as in M-A-J-O-R, major.
Measure, M-E-A-S.
Oh, measure.
U-R-E,
Measure.
measure.
Okay.
My question is,
I know your question hasn't been answered yet, but
Yeah,
we
there are
can
many
discuss
layers.
something, yeah.
But the people are working on this. They spend every morning. There's hundreds of people at the Land Institute. Every morning, they get the whole group. They're scientists, there's theologians, there's artists, all kinds of people. They get them all sitting down together for a discussion every morning, and so they're working out how do we work out all these things that are all interrelated. I really know very little of it, but I've been read a little bit.
Dinesh is best.
But anyway, go on.
okay, so in earlier, in the initial session, you have very well acknowledged that our society is of inequalities and there are structural inequalities prevalent in the society. And while you are presenting, while you are talking, you have stated many counter revolutions that have been happened in the other parts of the world, and we are also kind of witnessing that counter revolutionary thing. I mean, we are witnessing now right-wing populism as of now, and since our society is also not transformed, the way our constitution, indicates how it tells about. So in that context, how if I have misheard that, please correct me. you have proposed some alternatives or some possible solutions of like consultative governments, polyversity, or kind of governance. How is that possible in this society? And as Sohan also put that our society is inherently Dalal society. That it may sound cynical, but it seems like that. And,
Well,
and
the United States is a Dalal society too, even more so.
It may sound cynical, but the way our politics is getting driven, the way we are seeing some kind of, extremism, particularly the right-wing extremism, how could we, think of like something like that, consultative governments or polyversity in Nepal,
Yeah.
or in other part of the world?
Well, I think you can't just come in with a package, you're gonna have to work on it. And even things like consultative government, it took like years and years of work. Or the Land Institute, they've been working for 50 years, and they say it's gonna be 500 years. And that's not really a big scale, because, we have the scientific revolution, and that started back in the 500 AD. There's a group of monasteries, Benedictine monasteries, the Catholics have different groups. And there's one group who followed this guy by the name of Benedict. And they set up 12 monasteries. And those 12 monasteries, at that time the Christians were burning all the literature, the documents of the classical world, all the learning that had gone on for a couple thousand years. They were burning it all. And these monks, they went around and they saved all the documents they could find, and then they reproduced them. And that's one thing they did. A second thing they did, they grew their own food in each monastery. So then they had a very close relationship in which you combined the mental knowledge with the physical work. And so that was one of the foundations. It was this literature which then came out in the 12th, 13th, 14th century that provided the foundations for science. So that was a 1,000-year project that brought science to the world. And plus there are a lot of other things, like in ancient Rome in the 2nd century, there's a emperor, his name was Justin. And the word justice comes from that because he made a whole system of laws. And that permeated all of Europe. And it gave the idea that the whole world works in terms of laws. And again, that came to the basis for the scientific worldview, in which the whole universe works in laws, which he calls scientific laws. And there's other kinds of things. So it'll be a very long process. It'll be a very painful process. And likely maybe 80% of the world's population may be reduced by 80%. Don't want to say the bad or good. So we have to think, that's the kind of terms they're thinking of, that if we're going to solve things, it's going to be long. In fact, the founder of the Land Institute, his name is Wes Jackson, he said, if your life's project does not extend beyond your life, then you're thinking too small. And so I don't think the solutions are going to be easy. They're going to be different in each location. And in fact, those people are coordinating, building relationships and coordinating all over the world. There's maybe 30 different institutes which work with the Land Institute. In China, there's 13 philosophical institutes which are studying that philosophy. They're called process theory, but it comes out of the work of a philosopher by the name of Whitehead, who I said was kind of the Hegel of the 20th century. And so that each one is working on different kinds of problems depending upon the location.
So one last question.
Yeah.
उहाँले राख्नुभएको जिज्ञासा उत्पादनको वृद्धि अब अलिअलि त सम्भव होला, तर पुग्ने गरी त सम्भावना नै देख्दैन, किनकि हामी सार्वभौम छैन। उत्पादनको साधन अहिले प्रमुख साधन विज्ञान र प्रविधि भयो भन्दै छ। सही नै हो, उत्पादनको साधन विज्ञान र प्रविधि र विज्ञानमा हामी कति कमजोर छौँ। प्रविधिसम्म पनि हामी किन्न सक्दैनौँ। प्रविधि निर्माण या विज्ञानमा अनुसन्धान त धेरै टाढो। त्यसो भए हुनाले विज्ञान र प्रविधिसँग हामीले के विनिमय गर्ने, त्यो विनिमय गर्न सक्ने साधनमाथि हामी सार्वभौमिक छैनौँ। हाम्रो सार्वभौमिकता कायम छैन। मानवीय पुँजी, सामाजिक पुँजी अस्तव्यस्त छ, यो वास्ता गर्दैछ राज्यले, थाहा छैन कहाँ छ। प्राकृतिक पुँजी माथि हाम्रो सार्वभौमिकता गुमाइसकेका छौँ। अब यस्तो स्थितिमा उहाँ सर हाम्रो बिचको अन्तर्क्रियाबाट केही वृद्धि हुने उपायहरू त निस्कन सक्ला। अब स्टेफन माइक्सवेलज्यूले त उपाय नै दिनु भयो भने पनि ग्रहण गर्ने पक्षमा छैन हाम्रो नेपाल सरकार। यसलाई अभ्यासमा ल्याउने पाटोको सन्दर्भमा सार्वभौम नै छैन। न राज्य सार्वभौम छ, न नागरिक सार्वभौम छ। यस्तो परिस्थितिको बिचबाट हामीले उत्पादनलाई वृद्धि गर्नको निमित्त कस्तो सार्वभौम सत्ताको अभ्यास खोज्ने त? सार्वभौम सत्ता नै कस्तो खोजेको? अहिलेको परिभाषा र अभ्यासको सार्वभौम सत्ताले मात्रै पुग्छ त? मलाई लाग्छ पुग्दैन। त्यसो भए हुनाले एकपटक राज्य क्षेत्र जसरी बन्यो विश्वमा, देशहरू कसरी बन्यो विश्वमा, देशहरू राज्यहरू जसले आफूलाई सार्वभौम ठान्छ, त्यो बन्नुभन्दा अगाडि धेरै अगाडि एकपटक पुग्न जरुरी। त्यो प्राकृतिक सार्वभौम सत्ता के हो? त्यो सार्वभौमिकताको अभ्यास विश्वमा हुन सक्ने परिस्थितिको बिचबाट एउटा उपाय निष्क्रिय हो कि?
Yes.
यतातर्फ हाम्रा बहसहरू अगाडि जानुपर्छ कि भन्ने मलाई लाग्छ।
I have a sense of what
We
he's
have a
saying,
sense of
but
what he's
but but I
It
don't.
basically says we can't exercise our sovereignty politically, whether it's in terms of over natural resources, over human resources. Basically, we're not sovereign,
Right.
even when it comes to producing.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
what do we
Yeah,
do?
but I mean, in the United States, that's the problem too, that corporations rule the United States, and we have basically we have almost no sovereignty over. And so I think the way that we're working, we're kind of finding spaces that we can work in. But, I mean, it's not a very good answer, but, I mean, the real sovereigns in the world are the international corporations now. And they've created a whole system of governments, the IMF, the World Bank, what other thing, WTO, that came out of a conference in 1943 called the Bretton Woods Conference, in which the ruling powers are going to decide how they were going to rule the world after the war. And so they've built a gigantic bureaucracy on top of all the others, and that's controlling them. The United States is really badly shaped. It has a $33 trillion debt. It doesn't own the country, basically. The debt is to these foreign international corporations. And that's why you're seeing so much political upheaval now and anger in the United States too. It's the same all over the world. We have to figure out how to work in the spaces we have in order to develop something. But the other thing is, it's very likely how long can these corporations be ruling the world like that if they're destroying all the means for living in the world? So we have to be working out some alternative. Nobody has an answer. We're working, it's something everybody has to work on.
सो आई थिङ्क हामी अब यसलाई कन्क्लुड गर्छौँ। मलाई के लाग्छ भने अन्तिममा हामीले धेरै प्रश्नहरू लिएर जाँदैछौँ। यो आफैमा धेरै राम्रो कुरा हो होइन। सबै चिजको समाधान सबैको निम्ति एउटा खालको पनि हुँदैन। नेपालकै विभिन्न भूभागमै यही सार्वभौम सत्ता भनौँ अथवा होइन जमिनसँग भूमिसँग सम्बन्धित कुरा भनौँ, एउटै जवाब एउटै सल्युसन हामीले पाउन सक्दैनौँ होला। त्यसकारण यो उहाँले भन्नुभयो चाहिँ एउटा एकदम लङ टर्म अलिक धैर्यता चाहिने प्रक्रिया पनि हो। तर सँगसँगै अब भोग होइन अहिले नेपालमा जनताले भोगिरहेका होइन अब चर्को ब्याज दर होइन यो दैनिक हाम्रो जीविकोपार्जनसँग सम्बन्धित समस्याहरू हेर्दाखेरि फेरि त्यति धेरै धैर्य गर्ने स्थान पनि छैन वास्तविक उत्पादन गर्ने मान्छेहरूलाई होइन। हामी काठमाडौँमा बसेर अरूले उत्पादन गरेको चिज उपभोग गरिराख्नेहरूलाई त्यति ठुलो भनौँ न समस्या नहोला धैर्यताको हकमा। तर यही धैर्यता चाहिने सल्युसनको लागि समाधानको निम्ति चाहिने हाम्रो मेहनत धैर्यता सँगसँगै अलिकति वास्तविक जनताको कोणबाट हेर्दाखेरि अलिक द्रुत गतिमा पनि चाहिने हामीलाई समाधान, यसको बिचबाट नै हामीले सायद आगामी दिनमा यस्तै संवादहरूबाट नै केही थप खुराकहरू पाउँछौँ कि भन्दै यहाँ सबैलाई धेरै धन्यवाद दिन चाहन्छु। इट्स एन अनर एन्ड
Can I
प्लेजर।
say one other thing? From the concept of sovereignty itself has been a fable, a story from the start, from the very start, from 1500 years ago when it first was invented in France by the King Clovis. And that's why you have all these rituals like the, you know, when the Prime Minister goes around, he has the police going behind him, and you have fancy things. It's all to look like it's something which it is not.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I plan to learn a lot.